title, The Framework for Worship, I would like to take two ideas and put them together. The idea of worship and the idea of letting God be God. Worship is a great subject, especially today, because worship does not always receive the top billing that it should receive from Christian people. Because of that, some have chosen to leave us. I read an article that Jay Duff sent to me yesterday from The Wire CNN about why millennials are leaving the church. One of the reasons was worship. But you know what? They were not just dropping out of church. They are, like some of our own people that I know, have gone to the Roman Catholic Church, or gone to the Greek Orthodox Church, or some other church that has a higher form of worship. Some have chosen not to join a church because the worship is too formal. It's too straight-laced, not user-friendly enough. And while on the other hand, and this is where some of the information on the millennials was coming from, some have said, not that the worship was too solemn, too restrained, but it was too pop culture. And they wanted more of an experience in worship than they were finding. Our worship, regardless of the style of worship that we choose, has to first of all be consistent with the Word of God. Because God does not leave it up to us as to how we worship Him. He's already told us in His Word how we are to worship Him. And whatever method or mode we choose to do that, we have to do so realizing that we have to follow God's Word. And even in worship, it can be very tempting for us. The worship is the highest activity that any of us as human beings can be involved in. Can be very tempting to be extremist at this point. Balance is not always easy to come by. And many of our churches, many that I've been in over the years, are struggling with this topic. It's one of the hot topics that's out there in churches, even our own denominational churches today. I've read numerous books and written reviews on them in recent years in the publication that I was responsible for. My own agency for years conducted worship and music conferences around the church where on a Saturday we would have anywhere from 150 to 200 pastors and church musicians attend. We need to address worship. There's no doubt about it. But we need to do it from a biblical perspective. George Barna, a pollster that's familiar to many of us, said in one of his statistics that 39% of the people who attend worship regularly testify that they do not experience God in that worship. So if worship is a high privilege and an obligation, it's fitting that I think we should frequently consider this topic. I thought about an excellent book entitled The Gagging of God by Professor Don Carson, who teaches at Trinity Evangelical Seminary. He wrote this in that book. He said, in one of the essays that he read, Clyde Calver, who was a leader in evangelical circles both in America and England, made the following statement using the words from the musical My Fair Lady. He said, "Words, words, words, I'm sick of words. Sing me no song, read me no rhyme. Don't waste my time. Just show me." I think the world today, he said, is looking for evidence truth is real, that God is real. But they're looking for it in the way that we live, he said. And he went on to say, if Western culture's renewed interest in spirituality from a Christian perspective is swamped by emotionalism and sentimentalism, they're not going to find the truth from us. Carson went on to write that as America shucks off its Christian culture, it becomes more and more important for us as Christians to live contrary to our culture rather than conform to it. Now look at our scripture today. I want to read it, and then I'm going to relate an experience to you that I had a number of years ago as we look at this. From Genesis 50, beginning at verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw their father was dead, they said, it may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil we did to him. So they sent a message to Joseph saying, your father gave command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of God of your father. Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, behold, we are your servants. But Joseph said to them, do not fear, for I am in the place of God. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. While I was attending a meeting of the Westminster Seminary Board in Philadelphia a number of years ago, I was approached at the end of the board meeting by the campus chaplain, who asked me if I would be willing to be one of the speakers in a series they were going to present during the year in chapel on the topic of worship. As we talked about it, I said, he said specifically, I would want you to speak on family worship. So I thought about that for a minute, and I said, I think I could do that. After all, my family has worshiped over the years, and I have been able to put together a few sermons during that time. He said, okay, I would like for you to speak on family worship and use Luke 1 about John the Baptist as your text. So I agreed to that. And a number of ideas began to go through my mind as I was thinking about that opportunity to preach. And I thought this would be a good opportunity for me to say something that I think is not understood by so many Christians. And with those potential preachers there, maybe they would pick up on it. That worship is not only something we do together corporately, but worship involves our whole way of life. The Apostle Paul says, whether we eat or drink or whatever we do all to the glory of God. That's worship. The way we live every day demonstrates worship, how we worship and who we worship. Now, shortly after agreeing with Larry to do this, a matter of fact, it was about 10 days later that we learned our new little grandson by the name of Jake had developed suddenly a serious heart condition. It came on him all of a sudden, and it eventually required a heart transplant. So as I stood before that student body and faculty the next April, which we had agreed to, I began telling them of my experience. That when I agreed to preach the sermon on family worship, I thought I knew pretty much everything that I needed to know about that topic. But that God knew there were some things I did not yet know or incorporate in my thinking about family worship. And I said, so God had to teach it to me in a very arresting way. And so I began to talk about the birth of John the Baptist. Having said that, I talked about John being born into that Jewish family, the people coming together in Luke 1 for that joyous celebration of naming John, of having the feast of celebration, and then the sacrament of, at that time, of circumcision. And then I shared how the past 5 months since the December time had been such a special time in my life and the life of our family. Especially as it related to our grandson Jake. Then I had to tell them that the element I had not considered as I thought through the topic of family worship happened the Tuesday before I spoke in chapel that week. That my family had to worship God at little Jake's funeral. He had a transplant, and he lived for 3 weeks, and then God took him. And I said, that was an element of family worship I hadn't even thought about. We had to stand there and sing, "It is well with my soul," though our hearts were bleeding and hurting desperately from the sudden death of little Jake. But out of obedience in the midst of that pain, I said, we had to worship God as we committed Jake to Him. And that was the element of family worship that I had to learn in that graphic and painful way. And needless to say, that wasn't an easy lesson to learn. Not only seeing little Jake in Eggleston Hospital for almost 5.5 months, seeing what he had to go through, and then the heart transplant, and so on. I'd preached my dad's funeral a year earlier. My dad died at 80. He was a believer. His health was beginning to fail, and he was ready to be with the Lord. So that enabled me to stand and to preach my dad's funeral with some composure and assurance. But I thought, Jake, he's only 5.5 months old. His life was just beginning. That's another matter. And that experience made no sense to me. Absolutely not. I wondered, God, are you really there? Are you really in charge? You see, I knew that hundreds, maybe thousands of people had been praying for little Jake's healing throughout our church. And I had it all planned out, how God was going to do a miracle. That He was going to touch little Jake, and He was going to heal that heart without any further procedures. I knew God could heal. I didn't have any doubt in my mind about that. For I too had seen Him heal numerous people during my life. I had to do some serious soul searching amidst the pain and the hurt that I was feeling at that time. I had to know that Jake, because we were able to baptize him when he was 4 weeks old, I had that privilege. to know that Jake was a covenant child of God, and that for some reason it was God's plan and purpose to call Jake home. I had to come to the point where I had to say, let God be God. I told Colleen the night after the funeral in the afternoon, I said, this has been some experience, but one of the benefits that I've gleaned from this is to see how God had worked in the life of my children through this process, giving them a strong faith, to believe in God, to hold on to Him during that hardest trial that they had faced to that time. Now, knowing that God is God didn't necessarily numb my pain and hurt and confusion. The grief was real. But by His grace, we were able to saturate that grief with hope. We worshiped God that day, not because we felt like it, but out of obedience. We had to obey God. And then I thought of an interview that I had heard from my friend, the late Francis Schaeffer. An interview that was conducted by his son Frankie, now Frank, regarding the cancer that had taken over Dr. Schaeffer's body. He died later as a result of that cancer. In response to his son Frankie's questions in the interview, asking his dad how he was handling that, knowing that the prognosis was not good, Dr. Schaeffer said, I don't believe that most people take seriously enough the fall into sin. To me, he said, it's ground into the depths of my being. We live in a fallen world. This world is not going to be normal. It's abnormal. I'm not surprised, he said, when things are not normal. I'm not surprised, he said, when trouble comes. This is a spoiled universe. He said, now life is marvelous beyond words. My life with my wife, Edith, has been more precious than I can articulate. But the world is out of joint. The fall into sin is not only a theological concept, he said. It gives you a framework to see things that are real within a biblical framework. And he went on to talk about in the interview what we can learn about suffering, and he referred particularly to the book of Job and then later to some passages in Hebrews. And he even talked about the cruelty of some people, suggesting at a time when someone is suffering that God is doing that to you. His point was, we must not expect perfection until Jesus comes back. And one of the examples he used in the interview referred to Paul's thorn in the flesh. If you know that story, Paul prayed to God 3 times for God to remove that malady from him, but only to learn, as Dr. Schaeffer said, that God is not a dispensing machine. Then in the interview, Schaeffer said something that has stuck in my mind and my heart like a powerful magnet. And here's what he said. He said, by faith, we need to allow God to answer our prayers in light of His wisdom and not my limitedness. Let God be God, in other words. He said, this is not a cop-out. He's infinite. I'm finite. Nothing, and here it is. Nothing could terrify me more, said Dr. Schaeffer, than to think that I could ask God for something today and get it. He said, you know why? I don't know enough. I don't know enough, including my own health, and even in light of my cancer. He said, if I could, I would wave a wand and rid myself of cancer. I hate cancer. Who would want to have cancer? Cancer is not a good thing. On the other hand, he said more profoundly, while there's no pleasure in cancer, I can honestly say I had rather trust God's wisdom and what he's going to do with me than I had mine. I prayed, he said, if the Lord would be pleased that he would heal me, because I've seen him heal many people. I believe he could. I've seen him do it in others. Frankie, you had polio when you were born, and God healed you. But he said, again, I'm finite, and God is infinite. And I know he knows what's right. And remember, he said, our God is a personal God. He's not a mechanical God. Our God is our friend, but a friend who knows more than we know. And you know, as I thought about that interview during the time I was struggling, I thought, knowing Dr. Schaefer, here is a man who has it all together. He has a philosophy of life that is powerful and energizing, even in the face of death. And you know, God began to reassure me things were not out of his control. He wasn't unmindful of our situation with little Jake. He had heard our prayers. And in the midst of our pain and our hurt, we were struggling for those many months to see what was going to happen. I was reminded that we see through a glass darkly, but our God sees everything clearly. And again, as I said to Colleen that night after the funeral, one of the great joys that I have been able to experience through this is to see my children and how they've handled this and come through it with a strong faith in the Lord. Now that didn't ease my hurt. It didn't ease my pain, but it reassured me. It enabled me to grieve with hope. It enabled me to worship God at little Jake's funeral. And then I thought of Scott and Janet Willis, who loaded their 6 children in their minivan in Milwaukee, headed for a nearby town to visit their son in college. How en route they hit a metal object in the road, and it caused the minivan to be engulfed in flames. The van burned, killing all 6 children. Scott and Janet were saved, but they were severely burned. And as Janet looked back and saw that van in flames with her children burning to death, she said, "No, no." Scott put his hand on her shoulder, said, "Janet, this is what we've been prepared for." And then Ms. Willis later told the story to a room of friends. And she said, "You know, Scott was right. He was right. We belong to God. And our children belong to God." To which Scott said, "Janet and I do not take a short view of life. We take a long view, which includes eternal life. And as believers, we know one day we will be reunited with our children." And oh, how I thought their grief and their pain was more real and severe than many people will ever experience. The tragic loss of their children, the emptiness, the sadness, and the flood of emotions that must have been in their life at that particular time. But they had hope. in God to sustain them through this tragedy, bringing them to the conclusion that we have to let God be God. So you see, the two topics of worship and letting God be God do go together. Matter of fact, they must never be separated. Now let me make a couple of observations. First of all, we suffer because we do not suffer enough. And the other thing that we learn from this is what Dr. Schaefer learned, that by knowing certain things, we can be prepared for these kind of things. And though that knowledge doesn't necessarily keep us from hurting, from bleeding, from fragmenting in our lives, and though we may not be able to make any sense out of what's happening at that moment, God knows exactly what He's doing. His purpose is being served. And after all, that's what life is all about. Now, God's given us many passages in the Bible to teach us about Himself in this way. Job is a classic example in the Old Testament of how to deal with suffering. We could turn to Isaiah or Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, or we could read from Ecclesiastes, the wisdom book, or we could go to numerous New Testament passages. But I want to use the story I read to you this morning from the book of Genesis. It's a story that some of you probably learned in Sunday school as a child. Maybe you didn't. Maybe it's a new story to you. It's a story that's found in the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, the book that tells us of God separating and developing a people for Himself. It's a book that tells us of God creating, of man falling into sin, and of God promising to send a Redeemer. It's a story that tells about Father Abraham, who was called by God to walk by faith and not by sight and move into a land that he knew not where it was. The story continues with Abraham's son Isaac being born. Isaac gave birth to a son by the name of Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons. Some by Leah and some by Rachel. If you know that story, Jacob wanted to marry Rachel. And according to the custom, he couldn't. He had to marry Leah first, which he did. As I said, they had a family. But later, when it was possible for him to marry the love of his life, Rachel, they married. And they had sons, one of whom was named Joseph. What a story that was, the story of Joseph. And that's what I want you to think about. Now, it's obvious and a bit comforting as you read the story of Joseph and the whole bit that God doesn't always use perfect people in His story. That gives me some comfort. But He does show how He is faithful to those who are obedient to Him. Joseph was an unusual son. He had a lot of unusual abilities. One of those abilities was that of interpreting dreams. And one of the dreams that he had, as he interpreted it, he said, at some point, I'm going to rule over my brothers. And of course, that angered the brothers. They were furious with that, and so they devised a dastardly scheme to put Joseph to death. They hated him. But Reuben intervened and said, let's not do that. Let's sell him into slavery in Egypt. So what happened was they decided to sell him into slavery to a caravan of Egyptians that were passing through Canaan. Speaking of bad things happening to good people, At one time or other, all of us have to deal with what I'm talking about. I think about C.S. Lewis. You know that name? Great Christian. In 1944, Lewis wrote a book entitled The Problem of Pain. And what a powerful book that little book was. In there, he dealt with the question of why a good God could allow such terrible suffering. And in that book, he answered many complicated questions that theologians and philosophers had been asking down through the years. But in 1961, his wife died of cancer. The God that he had known personally, the God that he had written about in so many books like Mere Christianity, seemed to have abandoned him at that moment. He was angry. He was frustrated. He was confused. He was perplexed. He even at one point called God a cosmic sadist. And he doubted everything that he had ever believed. But then he said one morning, all of a sudden, he woke up to find that both his grief and his doubts had vanished. To which he said, you can't see anything clearly when your eyes are clouded with tears. And he wrote about that experience in a little book called A Grief Observed. He went through a deep valley. His faith and his knowledge, however, ultimately kicked in, and it brought him right through that valley. Joseph is a person who went through deep hurts and trials and ungodly situations, so much so that it would cause an ordinary person, I think, to denounce their faith and become a practicing atheist. But not Joseph. Joseph, remember, was sold into slavery to that Egyptian caravan. How his brothers told their father Jacob that Joseph had been killed by the wild animals. Joseph had every right to be angry, resentful, and wanting to get even with his brothers. And yet we see in Joseph an example of a person who trusted God, even in the face of tragedy. Was that a coincidence? Later, we find Joseph in Potiphar's house, where he was serving his Egyptian master, doing well. But all of a sudden, one day, he was seduced by Potiphar's wife to commit adultery with him, and he ran away from her and was falsely accused, of course, and thrown into prison. Again, what a tragedy. Once again, Joseph had been dealt a bad hand. He was in jail because of false charges. And yet, in jail, Joseph kept the faith. You know how God turned the tables in the story. How the Pharaoh had a dream and couldn't understand it, and Joseph happened to be the one who interpreted the Pharaoh's dream, and as a result, Pharaoh made Joseph the ruler over the Pharaoh's kingdom in Egypt. Then comes the famine in the land of Canaan, Joseph's family. At that time, Jacob sent his sons, Joseph's brothers, to Egypt to try to find some food to sustain the family during this time. By the way, you can find this colorful story in the last 8 chapters of the book of Genesis. Let me encourage you to find the time to read that, to see the whole story. So they came to Egypt to get some food. But Joseph then told his brothers who he was. And they feared for their life. After all, what they had done to Joseph. They had been falsely accused. But Joseph held no grudges. He said, go get Dad and the family, and you all come, and I'll take care of you. You see, Joseph knew that God was in control of all of this. His brothers were dumbfounded. They couldn't believe that Joseph could be so forgiving of them after all that they had done to him. And so the brothers said, you know what he's going to do? He's going to be easy on us until Dad dies. And when Dad dies, he's going to lower the moon and we're going to have it. And so as the brothers expressed that fear again to Joseph after Jacob died, it was that setting where Joseph quoted this verse that has sustained so many Christians down through the centuries. It's found in Genesis 50, verse 20. But before he quoted that verse, he said in verse 19, I am in the place of God. What you intended to be for evil, God intended for good.